England, 1814. A father signed a document. His daughter's name was in it. She was the last thing on the page.
To say.
My father traded me for land. He never expected the Duke to give me his title. She felt it now, sitting in the faded blue chair near the drawing-room window of Langley Park, watching her father rub the signet ring on his thumb with the particular agitation that meant he had done something he was not prepared to defend honestly. There is a particular kind of silence that descends on a household when a father has made a decision about his daughter's future without troubling to consult her, and Constance Langley had grown so familiar with that silence over the autumn of 1814 that she could feel it arriving in a room before anyone had spoken a single word to confirm it. The Rothermere boundary dispute had occupied Sir Henry Langley's every waking anxiety for the better part of 3 years, a tangle of inherited claims and ambiguous surveys that had cost the family the use of their best north fields, the fields that had once supplied the income that kept Langley Park from the particular genteel decay that had been creeping through its rooms since Constance's mother died and the household's careful management had died along with her. Constance had watched her father's hair grow grayer across those 3 years, had watched the household accounts grow thinner, had watched the particular dignity her mother had once maintained through careful economy slowly fray at every edge her father's anxious mismanagement touched. She had not, until this exact afternoon, understood the full scope of what he had been willing to trade in order to end the dispute. "The North Fields are mine again," Sir Henry said, still rubbing the ring, still not meeting her eyes. "The Duke of Rothermere has agreed to relinquish his claim entirely." Constance felt the particular cold that arrives before full understanding, the body recognizing danger before the mind has assembled the facts. "That is wonderful news, Papa," she said carefully. "What did it cost you?" Sir Henry's silence stretched long enough that Constance set down the embroidery in her lap, her thumb pressing into her opposite palm in the private gesture she had used since childhood to keep herself from saying something she could not retract. "What did it cost you?" she repeated. "A marriage settlement," Sir Henry said finally, the words coming in a rush, as though speed might make them less terrible. "Between yourself and the Duke. He has agreed to relinquish the North Fields claim in exchange for your hand." The drawing-room held the words the way cold rooms hold cold, completely, without dissipating. "You agreed to this," Constance said slowly, "without asking me." "I am asking you now," Sir Henry said, though the particular weakness in his voice made clear that the asking was a formality rather than a genuine question with 2 possible answers. Constance stood from the faded chair, her pale blue muslin skirt settling around her with the soft rustle of fabric too well worn to rustle properly anymore, and looked at her father with the particular clarity that arrives only when a long-building suspicion is finally, completely confirmed. "You have traded me for land," she said. "I have secured your future," Sir Henry said, his pale blue eyes finally meeting hers, carrying the particular defensive heat of a man who has convinced himself, through long practice, that his own desperate choices constitute reasonable parenting. "The Duke of Rothermere is one of the wealthiest men in England, Constance. You will want for nothing. You will be a duchess." "I did not ask to be a duchess," Constance said. "I asked to be consulted about my own marriage before it was arranged across a negotiating table like a parcel of contested fields." Her father had no answer for this, because there was no answer that would not require him to admit, plainly, that he had simply not considered her feelings relevant to the transaction at all. Constance left the drawing-room and climbed the narrow stairs to her own bedchamber, where she sat at the small writing desk that had once been her mother's and pressed her palms flat against the cool wood, breathing slowly, deliberately, the way her mother had once taught her to do when grief or fear threatened to overwhelm the careful composure a young lady was expected to maintain. She did not yet know anything about the Duke of Rothermere beyond his title and his evident willingness to acquire a wife as part of a land negotiation, and the not knowing frightened her considerably more than any specific cruelty might have, because at least a known cruelty could be prepared for. She did not know that the Duke himself was, at that exact hour, sitting in his own study at Rothermere Hall, staring at the signed settlement with an expression that carried none of the satisfaction a man might be expected to feel upon successfully resolving a 3-year boundary dispute, and a great deal of the particular discomfort of a man who has just realized, several hours too late, That he has agreed to something he does not actually want in the manner it has been arranged. Julian Ashford had not initiated the marriage clause. This was the detail that sat most uncomfortably with him, turning the signed settlement over in his hands in the library at Rothermere Hall while the autumn light failed outside the tall windows. Sir Henry Langley had proposed it himself, 3 weeks prior, arriving at Rothermere in a state of visible desperation and offering his daughter's hand as though she were simply another asset to be itemized alongside the disputed fields, and Julian, distracted by the tedious particulars of a boundary dispute he had inherited from his own father and found entirely uninteresting, had agreed to the broader terms without examining closely enough what, precisely, he was agreeing to acquire. He understood now, with the particular clarity that arrives too late to undo a decision but in time to regret its manner, that he had treated a woman's entire future as an incidental clause in a property negotiation, and the realization sat in his chest with the specific weight of a man who generally prided himself on better conduct than this. His grandmother found him there an hour later, the Dowager Duchess Margaret Ashford moving through the library with the particular fierce uprightness that 70 years of life had not managed to diminish, her cane tapping once against the floor as she settled into the chair across from his desk. "You have the look," she observed, "of a man who has done something correctly on paper and incorrectly in every other respect." "I have acquired a wife through a land settlement," Julian said. "I did not intend the acquisition to feel as transactional as it apparently was." The Dowager Duchess's pale green eyes studied him for a long moment. "Did you meet the young lady before agreeing to marry her?" she asked. "I have not yet had that pleasure," Julian admitted. "Then I suggest," his grandmother said, with the particular bluntness that decades of outliving everyone's patience for her opinion had earned her the right to deploy, "that you correct that oversight immediately, and that when you do meet her, you treat the meeting as an actual introduction between two people rather than the formal collection of an asset you have already paid for." She tapped her cane once against the floor, a gesture Julian recognized as the precursor to her most pointed observations. "I did not raise your father to treat people as transactions, and I will not watch you complete the pattern simply because the negotiations happen to be convenient." Julian called on Langley Park 3 days later, arriving in his second-best coat rather than full ducal display, having decided, after considerable private deliberation that mirrored, though he did not yet know it, a similar deliberation Constance's own future correspondent would one day undertake under nearly identical circumstances, that arriving with excessive grandeur would only emphasize an imbalance of power that already defined the entire arrangement more than he found comfortable. Constance received him in the drawing-room with the same faded blue chair she had occupied during her father's confession 3 days prior, her pale gold curls simply arranged, her blue-gray eyes meeting his with a directness that surprised him considerably more than he had expected to be surprised by anything related to this entire unwanted transaction. "You are not what I expected," she said, before either of them had managed any of the conventional opening pleasantries that Regency drawing-rooms typically demanded. "Neither," Julian said, "are you." I had prepared myself, in the privacy of my own anxious imagination, for tears, or anger, or the particular brittle gaiety of a woman performing acceptance she did not feel. I confess I am relieved to have been wrong about all three. Something in Constance's careful composure shifted, not quite a smile, but the early architecture of one. "You did not have to come yourself," she observed. "You could have simply sent your solicitor, the way these arrangements are usually managed." "I am aware of how these arrangements are usually managed," Julian said. "I did not care for the precedent, once I had time to consider it properly." He paused, choosing his next words with the particular deliberation that his grandmother had recommended and that he found, to his own mild surprise, entirely necessary rather than merely advisable. "I would like to ask you something, Miss Langley, and I would like an honest answer regardless of what answer you believe I wish to hear." Constance's hands, resting in her lap, pressed thumb against palm in the private gesture Julian could not yet read but would, in time, come to recognize as her particular tell. "Ask," she said. "Do you wish to refuse this arrangement?" Julian said. "Not whether you believe you are able to refuse it, given the settlement already signed between our fathers. Whether you wish to. I will not pretend the circumstances of how this came about are anything other than what they are, and I will not insult you by suggesting you had any genuine choice in the matter as it currently stands. But I find I would like to know, before anything further proceeds, whether marrying me is something you actively dread, or simply something circumstance has not yet given you the leisure to properly evaluate. Constance looked at him for a long moment, her blue-gray eyes carrying the particular weight of a woman determining, in real time, whether the man before her was offering genuine consideration or merely a more elegant performance of the same transactional cruelty her father had already shown her. "I do not dread it," she said finally. "I do not yet know what I feel about it, beyond a great deal of anger at my father, which I am attempting not to direct at you, since you did not create the circumstance, only accepted its terms without, I think, fully considering what those terms required of me." She paused. "I would like the chance to know you, Your Grace, before I am asked to spend the rest of my life married to whoever you turn out to be. That seems a reasonable thing to want, given everything else about this situation that has not been reasonable at all." "It is entirely reasonable," Julian said, and something in his chest, the particular discomfort that had been sitting there since he first understood the manner of his own engagement, eased very slightly, in a way he did not yet have full language for and would spend the following months slowly learning to name. "Then let us begin there," he said. "Knowing each other properly. The wedding can wait for whatever time that requires." Before he left that afternoon, Constance showed him, almost without intending to, the small portrait of her mother that hung in the modest hallway near the stairs, a watercolor sketch, not professionally rendered, the work of a traveling artist her mother had commissioned years ago when funds had still permitted such small indulgences. "She died when I was 19, Constance said, watching Julian study the portrait with the particular careful attention he seemed to bring to everything that mattered to him. "A fever that took her quickly, though it did not feel quick at the time. I have spent the 3 years since attempting to be, in whatever small ways I could manage, the kind of steady presence she was for this household, and I have largely failed, because my father's decisions outpaced whatever steadiness I could provide." "You did not fail," Julian said. "You simply could not single-handedly correct decisions that were never yours to make in the first place." He paused, his gray eyes still on the portrait. "I lost my own mother when I was quite young, before I properly understood what losing her meant. My father followed when I was 19, the same age you were when you lost yours. I have often wondered whether grief at that particular age leaves a deeper mark than grief experienced either earlier or later, old enough to fully comprehend the loss, too young to have yet built the steadier foundation that might absorb it more gently." Constance looked at him with new understanding. "Is that why you became so guarded?" she asked. "Why your wit turned sardonic rather than simply remaining sincere?" "I believe so," Julian said. "I inherited a title at 19 that made me, almost overnight, considerably more interesting to a great many people who had shown no particular interest in me before. I learned quickly to distrust enthusiasm, because so much of it proved to be enthusiasm for what I possessed rather than for who I actually was. The sardonic wit, I think, became a kind of test. If someone could withstand my deliberately unpleasant edges and still seek my company, perhaps their interest was genuine rather than merely acquisitive." "And have I withstood the test?" Constance asked, something almost playful entering her voice for the first time since they had met. Julian looked at her, and something in his careful expression shifted into an honesty that surprised them both. "You have not needed to withstand anything," he said quietly. "You have simply been yourself, entirely without performance, from the very first afternoon, and I find I have not once felt the need to deploy my usual defenses against you. That is, I think, a considerably more telling result than any deliberate test could have produced." The hallway held the moment in its particular quiet, the watercolor portrait of Constance's mother watching over both of them with her painted, gentle smile, and Constance understood, with the sudden clarity that arrives only rarely and is rarely mistaken when it does, that whatever grew between herself and this guarded, grieving duke was going to matter considerably more than either of them had anticipated when the settlement was first, so carelessly, signed. There is a particular dignity that does not announce itself loudly. It exists in the way a person holds their shoulders after discovering they have been treated as a transaction, the way they answer honestly even when honesty is the harder path, the way they ask, in the middle of their own crisis, to be known rather than simply acquired. Constance Langley was traded for a contested field, and she sat in her father's drawing room and absorbed the news with the particular stillness of a woman determining exactly how much of herself she was willing to surrender to a circumstance she had not chosen. When the Duke himself arrived, she did not weep or perform gratitude. She asked, simply and directly, to be known before she was married. That is not the behavior of someone resigned to her own diminishment. That is the behavior of a woman who understands, even in the worst circumstances, that her own dignity is not a clause to be negotiated away. If you have ever been handed a circumstance you did not choose and found, somewhere inside it, the strength to ask for something better than simple survival, you already understand exactly what is happening in this story. Subscribe to Regent Hearts right now if this has found you. Hit the bell so the next story reaches you the moment it goes live. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell us honestly, have you ever had to build your own dignity out of a situation that offered you none to begin with? What grows between Constance and Julian over the following months is going to surprise you both. Stay with us. For 2 months, Julian Ashford called on Langley Park nearly every week, and what grew between him and Constance in that time was not the swift, theatrical romance that drawing-room gossip preferred to imagine when it discussed dukes and their unexpected brides, but something slower and considerably more durable, the particular intimacy that develops between two people who have decided, independently and without announcing it to each other, to simply pay full attention. He learned that she pressed her thumb against her palm when suppressing strong feeling, a habit he found, to his own private surprise, entirely endearing rather than odd, the same way she had already noted his own habit of slowing his voice when something moved him genuinely. He learned that she had spent the 3 years since her mother's death quietly managing what remained of the Langley Park accounts behind her father's increasingly desperate decisions, not from any particular ambition but because someone needed to, and her father had proven himself incapable of the task. He learned that she still wore her mother's pearls to every evening she could justify wearing them, not from vanity but because the weight of them against her collarbone felt, she admitted once, like a small private comfort she was not yet ready to surrender. She learned, in turn, that his sardonic wit was armor rather than cruelty, deployed most heavily in exactly the rooms where he felt least genuinely seen, and that the rare moments his voice slowed into sincerity were considerably more valuable for their rarity. She learned about the father he had lost at 19, inheriting the dukedom far too young, surrounded immediately by people who wanted something from his title and very few who wanted anything from him as an actual person, which had taught him, across 12 years of careful watchfulness, to assume the worst of anyone's motives until they had proven otherwise across considerable time. I assumed the worst of your father's motives the moment he proposed the marriage clause, Julian told her, on an afternoon walk through the modest gardens behind Langley Park, the autumn leaves turning gold and rust around them. I did not, I confess, initially extend that same suspicion to you. I simply did not think of you at all, beyond an item in a settlement, and I find that failure considerably more uncomfortable to admit than any suspicion would have been. Constance walked beside him in silence for a long moment, her pale blue pelisse drawn close against the autumn chill, her blue-gray eyes on the gravel path ahead. I understand the failure, she said finally. I do not think you intended cruelty. I think you were tired of a tedious negotiation and did not examine closely enough what agreeing to its terms would actually cost someone else. She paused. I find I am no longer angry about it, if that eases your conscience at all. I was angrier at my father, who had every opportunity to consider me and chose not to, than I have ever managed to be at you, who at least had the decency to come and ask, once the oversight became clear to you. That is more grace than I have earned, Julian said. Perhaps, Constance said. Or perhaps grace is simply easier to extend to someone who has spent 2 months proving, through consistent and unglamorous attention, that the initial oversight was not the whole of his character. They stopped walking near a small stone bench at the garden's edge, and Julian turned to face her fully, his gray eyes carrying none of their usual sardonic distance. I would like to tell you something, he said, and I would like you to receive it as information rather than as pressure. You are under no obligation to respond to it today, or ever, if you find you do not wish to. Constance's hands pressed thumb to palm, the private tell Julian had learned, across 2 months, to read as the precursor to something that mattered considerably more than her composed exterior would suggest. Tell me, she said. I did not want a wife acquired through a land settlement, Julian said. I want to be entirely honest with you about that, because I think you deserve honesty more than you deserve comfortable evasion. But I find, after 2 months of knowing you properly, that I no longer think of you as something acquired at all. I think of you as a woman I have come to admire considerably more than I expected to admire anyone, given how thoroughly I had convinced myself, across 12 years of being valued primarily for my title, that genuine admiration from anyone connected to that title was simply not available to me. Constance felt something in her chest loosen that had been carefully, deliberately held tight since the afternoon her father first spoke the word settlement. I have spent 3 years, she said quietly, managing my father's household while he made increasingly desperate decisions, and I had begun to believe that my own worth, in anyone's accounting, amounted to whatever practical use I could be made to serve. You are the first person in a very long time who has asked me what I actually wanted, rather than simply informing me what I was required to provide. Then let me ask it properly, Julian said. Away from any settlement, any negotiation, any obligation neither of us initially chose. What do you want, Constance? She looked at him for a long moment, the autumn garden settling into its early evening hush around them, and when she answered, her voice carried none of the careful composure she had maintained since the first terrible afternoon in her father's drawing room. I want this, she said. I want to be known the way you have spent 2 months knowing me. I want to stop believing that wanting something good will mean it gets taken away, the way so much else has been taken these past 3 years. She paused, her hands finally still. I think I am beginning to care for you very deeply, Julian, and I find I am no longer interested in pretending otherwise simply because the beginning of this arrangement gave me every reason to expect something considerably less generous than what has actually grown between us. Julian reached for her gloved hand in the fading autumn light, and this time, neither of them hesitated. He raised it to his lips, the gesture entirely without performance, simply the unguarded instinct of a man who had spent 12 years assuming genuine connection was not available to him and had finally, in a modest garden behind a struggling country estate, run out of reasons to keep believing it. I am already there, he said quietly. I believe I have been there for rather longer than I permitted myself to admit, even to myself. They walked back toward the house as the light began to fail, not quite touching, not quite separate, carrying between them the particular fragile certainty of 2 people who had each, independently, decided to risk wanting something real, and had discovered, in the risking, that the other had been brave enough to arrive at precisely the same decision. It was the following week, at a small assembly held at the village hall near Langley Park, nothing so grand as Almack's, simply a modest country gathering of the local gentry, but the first occasion on which Constance and Julian had appeared together before any audience beyond their own families, that Constance understood, with sudden and complete clarity, exactly how thoroughly the entire neighborhood's opinion of her had already begun to shift. She had grown accustomed, across the preceding 3 years of her family's quiet decline, to the particular condescension of women who had once considered her mother an equal and now regarded Constance herself with the careful, pitying distance reserved for genteel poverty, invited still, because manners demanded it, but seated always slightly apart, included always slightly less than fully. This evening, the moment she entered on Julian's arm, that careful distance evaporated entirely. Mrs. Pemberton Hale, who had not addressed Constance directly in over a year, crossed the room within minutes to compliment her gown. Lady Ashby, whose daughters had once been instructed not to seek out Constance's company lest reduced circumstances prove contagious by association, now maneuvered her own daughters toward introductions with visible eagerness. Constance watched all of this unfold with a complicated mixture of vindication and something closer to grief, and Julian, standing beside her with his hand resting lightly at her back, seemed to read the complexity of her expression without needing to ask. They do not see me any differently than they did a month ago, she said quietly, as Lady Ashby withdrew with her daughters toward the refreshment table. They see only your title beside my name now. I have not changed. Only my circumstances have. I am aware of the distinction, Julian said, his voice dropping into the particular slowness that signaled genuine feeling. It is among the more dispiriting aspects of moving through society with any title at all, watching people's regard for you expand and contract according to nothing you have actually done, but simply according to what your presence might be worth to them. He paused. I find, however, that I do not particularly care what Lady Ashby thinks of either of us. I care what you think of yourself, and I would ask that you not allow her sudden enthusiasm to convince you that your worth was ever genuinely in question before tonight. Constance looked at him, the assembly room's modest candlelight catching the particular warmth in his grey eyes, and felt something in her chest settle that had been unsteady since the moment she first understood how completely her father's desperation had nearly cost her any say in her own future. May I have this dance? Julian asked, extending his hand with a formality that carried, beneath its surface, something considerably warmer. You may, Constance said, and let him lead her onto the modest dance floor, where the local musicians played with more enthusiasm than precision, and where Constance found herself laughing, genuinely and without any careful management of the sound, for what felt like the first time in years. It was the laugh, more than anything that had passed between them across the preceding weeks, that seemed to undo something in Julian entirely. He missed a step, recovered, and looked at her with an expression so thoroughly unguarded that several of the watching matrons later remarked, with considerable satisfaction, that they had never seen the Duke of Rothermere look at anyone in quite that particular way. What? Constance asked, still smiling, as the dance carried them past each other and back together again. Nothing, Julian said. Only that I do not believe I have heard you laugh properly before this exact moment, and I find I would like to arrange considerably more occasions for it to happen again. Then you shall have to be amusing more often, Constance said. I shall endeavor to disappoint you as rarely as possible, Julian said, and the particular warmth in his voice as he said it carried her through the remainder of the dance, and the remainder of the evening, and very nearly the remainder of the considerable doubt she had carried since the terrible afternoon her father first spoke the word settlement. It was 3 weeks later, with the wedding date set for early spring and the careful courtship having grown into something neither Constance nor Julian would have traded away for any circumstance the world might have offered instead, that Sir Henry Langley arrived unannounced at Rothermere Hall, his pale blue eyes carrying a desperation considerably sharper than the one that had originally driven him to trade his daughter for a contested field. Julian received him alone in the study, having learned enough of Constance's father across the preceding weeks to suspect that whatever brought him here uninvited would require careful handling rather than simple welcome. I find myself in further difficulty, Sir Henry said, without any of his usual preamble, rubbing his signet ring with visible agitation. The North Fields, once recovered, required considerable investment to restore to profitability. I had not anticipated the expense. I find I require additional funds. Julian studied the man across his desk for a long moment, understanding, with the particular clarity that comes from watching a pattern repeat itself, that Sir Henry Langley had not learned anything at all from the consequences of his first desperate trade. You wish me to extend further credit, Julian said, on the strength of the marriage settlement that already cost your daughter her say in her own future. I would not ask if I had any other option, Sir Henry said. You did not consider whether your daughter had any other option, Julian said, his voice dropping into the particular slowness that those who knew him had learned to recognize as genuine feeling rather than his usual sardonic distance, when you offered her as your option. I find I am not inclined to extend you a consideration you did not extend to her. Sir Henry's desperation curdled, in the space of a single breath, into something uglier. She has landed rather well, he said, for a young woman who was simply part of a property negotiation. A duchess, comfortable, courted properly by a man who could have, by every right the original settlement granted him, simply claimed his due without any of this elaborate patience. I do not see why you cannot extend a small further consideration, given how generously circumstance has treated her since. Something in Julian's careful composure went very still, the particular stillness Constance had learned, across 2 months, to recognize as his most dangerous expression rather than his calmest. Constance has landed well, Julian said, because I came to know her as a person rather than simply collecting her as an asset, which is considerably more than you ever attempted across 22 years of raising her. I will not extend you further credit, Sir Henry, and I will tell you plainly that if you attempt to approach my future wife directly with this same request, I will consider it grounds to revisit every term of the original settlement, including the boundary concession that started this entire arrangement. Sir Henry's face went through several rapid recalculations, settling finally into the particular pale resentment of a man who has discovered that his usual methods have, for the first time in years, met an obstacle he cannot simply maneuver around through pressure or guilt. He left without further argument, and Julian sat alone in his study for a long while afterward, turning over the particular discomfort of having just confirmed, beyond any remaining doubt, exactly how little regard Constance's own father held for her beyond her usefulness to his own circumstances. He told Constance about the visit that same evening, watching her face move through a complicated sequence of emotions, surprise, then a kind of weary recognition, then something that settled, after several long moments, into a grief that had clearly been building beneath her composure for considerably longer than this single incident could account for. "I am not surprised," she said finally, once Julian had finished the account. "I have spent 3 years watching my father make exactly this kind of decision, over and over, each one more desperate than the last. I had simply hoped, perhaps foolishly, that securing my marriage might have been the last time he treated me as a resource to be spent rather than a daughter to be considered." "I am sorry," Julian said. "Not for refusing him, I do not regret that. I am sorry that you have spent your entire life with a father who required you to provide rather than simply permitted you to be his daughter." Constance was quiet for a long moment, her hands pressed thumb to palm, working through something Julian could see forming behind her careful blue-gray eyes. "I find," she said slowly, "that I am grieving something I am not certain I ever actually had. I do not think my father ever loved me the way a father is meant to love a daughter, not cruelly, precisely, but absently, as though I were simply one more household expense to be managed alongside the roof repairs and the unpaid accounts." She paused. "I have spent considerable energy, across these recent months, trying to determine whether that absence was somehow my fault, some deficiency in myself that made me easier to overlook than to cherish." "It was never your deficiency," Julian said, with the particular gentle firmness of a man who had clearly thought carefully about exactly this question before speaking it aloud. "It was his. You have shown me, across 2 months of knowing you, a capacity for honesty and dignity and genuine warmth that any father ought to have recognized and treasured from your earliest childhood. The failure to see it was entirely his limitation, Constance, and I will not allow you to carry it as though it were yours." Something in Constance's careful composure broke open then, not into tears exactly, but into a kind of release Julian had not yet witnessed from her, the particular unburdening of a grief that had been quietly compressed for years finally given permission to exist in the open air rather than behind careful management. "Thank you," she said, her voice rougher than usual. "I do not think anyone has ever told me, quite so plainly, that the absence was not my fault." "Then I will tell you as many times as you require it," Julian said, "until you no longer need the telling at all." It was the Dowager Duchess, in the end, who delivered the piece of information that neither Constance nor Julian had anticipated, and she delivered it on a quiet morning in the Rothermere Hall breakfast room, 6 weeks before the wedding that had, by then, become something neither of them would have traded away for any circumstance the world might have offered instead. "Julian," his grandmother said, setting down her teacup with the particular deliberateness that meant whatever followed would require his full attention, "there is a matter from some years past that I believe you ought to know, now that Constance is to become part of this family permanently." Julian set down his own cup, recognizing, from long acquaintance with her tone, that whatever followed would matter considerably more than ordinary breakfast conversation. "Do you recall," the Dowager Duchess said carefully, "the dispute over the North Fields, the one your father inherited from his own father, and that has occupied 3 generations of Ashford solicitors without ever being properly resolved until your own settlement with Sir Henry?" "Vaguely," Julian said. "I understood it as a matter of ambiguous boundary surveys dating back decades." "It is rather more complicated than ambiguous surveys," his grandmother said. "I have known the truth of it for 30 years, and I have said nothing, because saying something seemed, for most of those 30 years, to serve no useful purpose." She paused, choosing her words with evident care. "Your grandfather did not lose the North Fields claim through any legitimate dispute, Julian. He lost it through a private wager with Constance's own grandfather, the elder Sir Langley, a wager he made while considerably the worse for drink one evening and never honored, because by the following morning he had convinced himself the debt of honor did not survive the disgraceful circumstances of its making. Julian's expression had gone very still, the particular stillness Constance had learned to read as his most genuine response rather than his most performed. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that the fields my father spent years trying to reclaim were never legitimately disputed at all. That my own grandfather simply refused to honor a debt." "I am telling you precisely that," the Dowager Duchess confirmed. "And I am telling you that Sir Henry Langley's own desperate, dishonorable trading of his daughter to settle what he understood as a contested claim was, in fact, an attempt to recover something his own family was rightfully owed 30 years before either of you was born. He behaved abominably in how he went about it, and I will not defend the manner of his conduct toward Constance for one moment. But the underlying grievance, Julian, was never his fabrication. It was ours." The breakfast room was very quiet. "Does Constance know any of this?" Julian asked. "I do not believe so," his grandmother said. "I do not believe Sir Henry himself fully understood the original circumstances. I suspect he knew only that his family had once been owed something by ours and had never received it, without knowing the particular dishonor of how the debt came to be abandoned. Some grievances are easier inherited as a vague resentment than explained in their full, embarrassing detail." Julian sat with this for a long moment, the architecture of an entire history rearranging itself in his understanding, the woman he was about to marry connected, by a thread of circumstance neither of them could have anticipated, to his own family's oldest unaddressed dishonor. He went to Constance that same afternoon, finding her in the modest Rothermere library where she had taken, across recent weeks, to spending her mornings, and told her everything his grandmother had revealed, watching her face move through shock, then a slow and painful recognition, then something that settled, after several long minutes of silence, into a complicated grief for a father whose desperate, clumsy attempt to recover an old family debt had cost her so much more than he had ever properly understood it might. "He never told me any of this," Constance said quietly, once she had absorbed the whole account. "He let me believe the dispute was simply some recent misfortune, a complication of boundary surveys he could not control. He never once suggested there was an old dishonor underneath it, something his own family had been quietly resenting for 30 years. He likely did not fully understand it himself," Julian said gently. "Some grievances pass down as feeling long after the specific facts have been lost. I suspect your father knew only that the Ashfords owed his family something, without ever learning the particular shame of how the debt came to be abandoned." Constance was quiet for a long moment, her hands pressed thumb to palm with the particular agitation Julian had come to recognize across the preceding months. "This changes things," she said finally. "I am marrying into the very family whose dishonor, 30 years ago, set this entire desperate chain of decisions in motion." "It does change things," Julian agreed. "I will not pretend otherwise." He paused, choosing his next words with the careful deliberation she had come to associate with the moments that mattered most to him. "But I find I would like to offer you something, if you will permit it. Not as a transaction, the way this entire arrangement began. As a correction, as much as one is possible across 30 years and two desperate, flawed men who never spoke honestly to each other about what either of their families actually owed the other." "What correction?" Constance asked. "I would like to give you the title properly," Julian said, "and not simply through marriage. I have spoken with my solicitor this morning, and there exists, within the particular and rarely used provisions of the Rothermere patent, a mechanism by which I may settle certain honors and properties directly upon you, in your own name, separate from whatever claim marriage alone would grant you." He withdrew, from his coat pocket, a small velvet box, opening it to reveal not a betrothal ring but the heavy ducal signet his own grandfather had once worn, the same ring, Constance understood with a sudden, overwhelming clarity, that had likely been on her own grandfather's mind on the night of the wager that started this entire chain of consequence 30 years before. "This is not how dukedoms are usually given away," Julian said, his grey eyes carrying none of their usual guarded distance. "But I find I no longer care what is usual. I would like you to hold this not as my wife alone, but as a woman in your own right, with whatever claim and dignity this family's old dishonor denied your own family for 30 years. Constance's hand rose to her mouth, her blue-gray eyes bright with tears that carried nothing of grief and everything of overwhelming, complicated relief. "You do not have to do this," she said. "I do," Julian said simply. "Because the alternative is allowing an old dishonor to remain quietly buried simply because addressing it properly is complicated, and I find I am no longer interested in the kind of comfortable forgetting that requires looking away from difficult truths. I learned that lesson, I think, the moment you sat in your father's drawing room and asked, even amid your own crisis, to be properly known before you were married. I do not intend to abandon it now." Constance went to her father 2 days later, finding him alone in the small study at Langley Park where he had spent so many recent years making the desperate decisions that had shaped her entire adult life, and she sat across from him with a composure that no longer required the particular effort it once had. "Papa," she said, "I know the truth of the old wager now. I know your father was owed an honest debt that Julian's grandfather refused to honor, and I understand, I think, that some part of what drove you to trade me so carelessly was an old grievance you yourself never fully understood, inherited as resentment without ever being explained as fact." Sir Henry's pale blue eyes, for once, did not slide away from hers. "Julian told you," he said. "His grandmother told him," Constance said. "He told me." She paused, choosing her next words with the particular care she had learned, across recent months, from watching Julian navigate difficult truths without flinching from them. "I understand the grievance now, Papa. I do not excuse how you acted upon it. You traded me without asking, without considering for one moment what the trading would cost me, and I do not think an old inherited resentment, however legitimate its origin, justifies what you did to your own daughter in service of resolving it." "I know," Sir Henry said, and his voice carried, for the first time in Constance's memory, an honesty entirely without the particular self-justifying heat he usually wrapped around his failures. "I have known it since the moment Julian refused my request for further funds and told me, plainly, exactly how little regard I had shown you across your entire life. I did not wish to hear it. I have spent considerable effort, since that conversation, attempting to determine whether he was correct." "And what have you determined?" Constance asked. "That he was entirely correct," Sir Henry said. "I have spent years treating you as a problem to be managed alongside the household accounts and the unpaid debts, rather than as my daughter, who deserved considerably better from me than I ever troubled myself to provide. Your mother would be ashamed of me, Constance. I have spent 3 years failing to be even half the parent she was, and I let my own fear and desperation excuse decisions that should never have required excusing in the first place." Constance felt something in her chest she had not expected to feel, not quite forgiveness, not yet, but the early architecture of something that might eventually grow into it, the particular softening that comes from finally hearing an apology offered without qualification or defense. "I am not yet able to tell you that all is forgiven," she said honestly. "I do not think honesty would serve either of us well if I pretended otherwise. But I am able to tell you that I heard you, Papa, and that hearing an apology offered plainly, without excuse, matters more than you may understand. I have spent my whole life wondering if I was simply easier to overlook than to love properly. I would like, going forward, the chance to discover whether that wondering was ever actually true." "It was never true," Sir Henry said, his voice breaking slightly on the words. "You were never easier to overlook, Constance. I was simply too consumed by my own failures to give you the attention you deserved, and that failure was entirely mine, never yours." They sat together for a long while after that, not quite reconciled, but no longer entirely estranged either, the particular quiet of two people who have finally spoken an honest thing aloud and are learning, slowly, what to build in the space the honesty has cleared. Constance Langley and Julian Ashford were married in early spring, in the small chapel on the Rothermere estate grounds, with Sir Henry Langley seated in a pew toward the back, considerably humbled by a conversation Julian had insisted upon having with him privately in the weeks prior, a conversation in which the full history of the original wager had finally been spoken plainly between both families, 30 years too late but spoken nonetheless, and in which Sir Henry had been required, for the first time in his daughter's memory, to apologize to her directly and without qualification for treating her as a transaction rather than a person he was obligated to cherish. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew in her deep plum silk, her cane resting against the bench, her pale green eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of a woman who had carried a complicated family secret for 30 years and had finally watched it resolve into something considerably better than the dishonor that created it. Constance wore her mother's pearls, and beneath her glove, on her right hand, the heavy ducal signet that Julian had formally settled upon her 3 weeks prior in a private ceremony witnessed by his solicitor and his grandmother, a title and claim entirely her own, separate from anything marriage alone might have granted her, the particular correction of an old wrong that no apology alone could have fully addressed. When Julian kissed her at the altar, the small chapel filled with the particular warmth of two people who had built something entirely real out of circumstances that had given them every reasonable excuse to build nothing at all, a contested field, a desperate father's clumsy attempt to recover an old family debt, a 30-year-old dishonor finally brought into the light and answered with something better than apology. That evening, after the wedding breakfast had concluded and the last of the guests had departed Rothermere Hall, Constance found Julian in the library where she had spent so many recent mornings, standing before the tall windows with a glass of wine he had not yet touched, watching the early spring dusk settle over the grounds. "You are not celebrating," she observed, coming to stand beside him. "I am," he said. Simply quietly. He turned to look at her, his grey eyes carrying the particular softness she had learned, across the preceding months, to recognize as his truest expression rather than any performed one. "I find that the moments which matter most to me have always required quiet rather than noise. My father's death taught me that. My mother's, before it. I learned early that the largest feelings are often the ones that ask least to be announced." Constance considered this, looking out at the darkening gardens where they had once walked through autumn leaves discussing grief and inheritance and the particular loneliness of being valued for a title rather than a self. "I am glad," she said, "that you chose to announce this one to me, however quietly. I do not think I would have understood, on that terrible first afternoon in my father's drawing room, that the transaction I dreaded so completely would become the truest happiness I have ever known." Julian set down his untouched wine and took both her hands in his thumb finding, without seeming to think about it, the particular spot on her palm where she had spent a lifetime pressing down her own suppressed feeling. "You do not need to press it down any longer," he said gently, noticing the old habit even now. "Whatever you feel, Constance, I would like you to simply feel it. Loudly, if you wish. Quietly, if that suits you better. But never again press down out of fear that wanting something will mean losing it." Constance felt her eyes fill, not with the careful, contained tears she had permitted herself throughout the difficult months of her courtship, but with something fuller and entirely unguarded. "I love you," she said, the words arriving without any of the careful deliberation she usually brought to significant declarations. "I do not believe I have said that plainly yet, in all our months of careful honesty with each other, and I find I no longer wish to leave it unsaid." "I love you as well," Julian said, his voice dropping into the particular slowness that had once signaled rare sincerity and now, simply, signaled everything he felt for her at every hour of every day. "I believe I have loved you since the autumn garden, though I did not yet have the courage to name it so plainly until this exact moment." They stood together in the library as the spring dusk deepened into full evening, the portrait of Constance's mother watching, somewhere down the hallway, over a household that had finally, after so much difficult honesty, learned to hold its love without fear of the cost. Sir Henry Langley spent the remaining years of his life considerably more careful with the family's finances, chastened, Constance suspected, less by any specific punishment than by the particular shame of having finally understood, in full and humiliating detail, exactly what his own desperate decision-making had cost his daughter across the years he might otherwise have spent simply loving her without condition. Constance Ashford, Duchess of Rothermere in her own right as much as through marriage, spent the long, contented years that followed managing not only her own household but, eventually, a small charitable foundation she established specifically for young women whose families had attempted to trade their futures away for financial convenience, an institution that quietly, steadily, across decades, gave considerably more young women the chance Constance herself had only narrowly found, the chance to be known, properly and entirely, before anyone decided their future on their behalf. Julian never fully lost the sardonic edge that had once been his armor, but it softened, across the long years of their marriage, into something closer to genuine warmth deployed for amusement rather than defense, and the particular slowing of his voice that had once signaled rare, guarded sincerity became, eventually, simply how he spoke to her every single day, without rarity, without guard, without anything left to protect against. Constance Langley was traded for a contested field, by a father who valued his own desperate finances over her dignity, to a stranger who could have simply claimed what the settlement granted him without a single thought for what she might need instead. He chose differently. He chose to ask her what she wanted before he asked anything further of her at all, and in the slow, patient building that followed, months of honest conversation, an old family dishonor finally brought into the light, a title given not as a transaction but as a correction. Two people who began as a property negotiation built something that no settlement, no contested field, no desperate father's clumsy maneuvering could ever have predicted. If Constance's story found you somewhere real today, if you have ever been treated as negotiable by someone who should have known better, and found, somewhere in the wreckage, a person who finally treated you as entirely your own to give, then you already understand exactly why this channel exists. Subscribe to Regent Hearts right now if you have not already. Hit the bell so the next story finds you the moment it goes live. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from, and tell us honestly, did you see the truth about the old family wager coming, or did it catch you exactly the way it caught Constance? Share this with someone who needs to remember that being traded is never the same as being worthless. The next story is already waiting. We will see you there.